Desde su fundación, poco después del final de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, la Agencia Central de Inteligencia de los Estados Unidos, más conocida por sus siglas CIA, emprendió una serie de operaciones para combatir la idea y la práctica del comunismo. Algunas de estas operaciones implicaron espionaje, golpes de Estado e incluso atentados de falsa bandera, a veces en cooperación con servicios de inteligencia de otros estados y con la OTAN. De las operaciones de este tipo, quizás la más conocida sea la Operación Gladio, sobre la cual hay un importante libro titulado Los ejércitos secretos de la OTAN, del profesor suizo Daniel Gans. Otras operaciones, sin embargo, se orientaron a la llamada guerra psicológica y cultural. En este aspecto, desde la década de los 60 del siglo pasado, la CIA ha estado ejerciendo un control más o menos directo sobre la producción cultural e intelectual, así como sobre su circulación y recepción, con el objetivo de eliminar la influencia de los intelectuales marxistas, que fue muy importante en las décadas previas de los 30, 40 y 50, y de la izquierda comunista en general. Sobre este fenómeno hay algunos estudios ya publicados hace algunos años. Uno destacable es el libro titulado La Guerra Fría Cultural, de la periodista e historiadora británica Frances Stoner Saunders. Una investigación más reciente, todavía en curso, es la llevada a cabo por el filósofo estadounidense Gabriel Rockhill, que realizó sus estudios en Francia. Actualmente es profesor de Filosofía en la Universidad de Villanova de Filadelfia y es director fundador del taller de Teoría Crítica. El profesor Rockhill está embarcado en un análisis materialista de las fuerzas sociales, políticas e institucionales que operan tras lo que él denomina la industria de la teoría global, es decir, la producción de las ideas que la clase dominante considera legítimas, entre comillas, para el uso del público, ideas que surgen de las universidades y se difunden también en la prensa, las industrias culturales y lo que se suele denominar la esfera pública. El estudio de Gabriel Rockhill revela aspectos fundamentales para entender la realidad presente tanto a nivel intelectual como político y sociocultural. Su trabajo tiene puntos de encaje con los estudios de otros dos intelectuales que hemos entrevistado aquí en Canarias Semanal, en concreto el profesor Francisco Erice sobre posmodernismo y el profesor Andrés Piquera sobre los neomarxismos y los postmarxismos. Pues bien, el propio Gabriel Rockhill ha tenido la amabilidad de aceptar nuestra invitación para que sea él mismo quien nos desvele los principales aspectos de su investigación y en qué consiste el taller de teoría crítica que él dirige. Profesor Rockhill, bienvenido a Canarias Semanal y muchas gracias por atendernos. Thank you so much for joining us.
Gracias.
Profesor Rockhill, explíquenos de la manera más sucinta posible qué es la industria de la teoría global, de qué fuentes se alimenta, cuáles son sus productos, sus objetivos y los mecanismos de los que se sirve para su difusión a nivel mundial.
The global theory industry is a system of intellectual production, circulation, and consumption within the capitalist world. Just as we have a music industry or a movie industry, it is important to recognize that the products of high culture, like theory, are also the result of material forces that are centrally controlled by the bourgeoisie and overseen by their elite managers. This has been the case throughout the history of capitalism, but since approximately World War II, you see an intensification of the centralized control and broad industrialized networks in order to be able to manufacture ideas and then circulate them globally as the most important commodities in the so-called marketplace of ideas. This has included the development of an entire infrastructure, right, of universities and think tanks and governmental agencies and propaganda platforms that are really capable of transforming the work of an individual theorist, if that theorist be someone like Jacques Derrida or Francis Fukuyama or Samuel Huntington, into an indispensable commodity that everyone who is worthy of the name of an intellectual needs to read and engage with. The global theory industry has risen, funded, and supported by the major corporate institutions, a network of capitalist foundations like Ford, Mellon, Rockefeller, Carnegie, et cetera, and various governmental agencies. You referenced in your introductory comments the Central Intelligence Agency, but of course there is also the USAID, the NED, MI6, and many, many others involved in the construction, consolidation, and development of the global theory industry. And I think that one of its fundamental goals historically has been to establish the very parameters of acceptable public debate. And a lot of this has had to do with policing the left border of critique. And so my own research has focused more specifically on the work of those intellectuals who I refer to as radical recuperators, meaning the ones who are marketed as radical. We could think of Jacques Derrida or Michel Foucault or Alain Badiou and Slavoj Žižek. But ultimately, if one pays attention to the details of their analyses, they seek to recuperate critical theory within the anti-communist camp, meaning very precisely within the camp of those who are opposed to actually existing socialism, although there are a few explainable exceptions in the case of Badiou and others that we could, of course, discuss. But what they therefore put forth is a theoretical orientation that is very critical of capitalism in certain instances, but at the end of the day, the message is that the alternative is much worse. And so this means that structurally speaking, they abide by Margaret Thatcher's slogan, Tina, there is no alternative. And that's why I refer to their work as ABS theory or ABS theory. It's anything but socialism. And so the radical recuperators are an important wing of what the CIA has called the compatible left, meaning the left that might put forward some discursive critiques of capitalism, but will line up at the end of the day because it is compatible with capitalism and compatible with imperialism. Slavoj Žižek just recently came out in support of the US proxy war in Ukraine. And it's one example amongst many others of the work that these intellectuals do. CIA officer Thomas Braden, back in the day, who oversaw many of these operations, identified the socialists as the only ones who, quote, give a damn about fighting communism. And this is one of the reasons that he was involved in the establishment of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, an enormous worldwide network that had offices in some 35 countries. It was basically an anti-communist propaganda operation for and driven by the intelligentsia. And this actually picked up on the work of MI6, which had established the Information Research Department in the Foreign Office that had 400 to 600 professional anti-communist propagandists working for it, who were pumping out much of the literature on the Soviet Union, on China, and other such things. And so the global theory industry plays a very important role in the intellectual world war against communism, and they've produced a number of important phenomena, such as French theory, critical theory more generally, but of a more recent date are developments like post-colonial theory, decolonial theory, liberal queer theory, Afro-pessimism. These are all products that need to be understood as consumer products, because unfortunately within bourgeois cultural production, we are trained, in fact, indoctrinated into what I refer to as cultural commodity fetishism, in which we fetishize individual cultural producers and their special and unique products. And we never ask ourselves the question of the system that produced these intellectuals in the first place, elevated them and gave them the resources necessary to produce the products that then we are told need to be studied only in isolation. And so a lot of my own work looks at a systemic analysis of this global theory industry in order to break through the cultural commodity fetishism and bring to the fore the social relations of intellectual production. And maybe I'll just close by a quick example that illustrates that. And that is that when French theory arrived in the United States, many people reference the date of 1966 when a famous conference was organized on structuralism at Johns Hopkins University. That was October 1966. What's remarkable about this moment is that all of the major French theorists who were doing structuralism, or what some would later call post-structuralism, were invited, with the exception of the communists, who were considered persona non grata in the United States. So someone like Althusser wasn't invited. There's the possible exception of Lucien Goldman, and this is his work could be discussed in a kind of broader investigation into this, but there was a clear political agenda in this. And the funding for this particular conference that launched French theory in the Anglophone world, and at the end of the day, French theory itself is very much an American product. This was funded by the Ford Foundation to the tune of $36,000, which is the equivalent of $330,000 today, not only for the conference itself, but then also for other seminars. And it led to a collaboration with, where Yale University also got involved in this kind of euphoric celebration of this new modality of French theory. And we would be well served to remind ourselves that the president of the Ford Foundation at that point in time was McGeorge Bundy, who had just come off a stint as National Security Advisor, where he was involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, the intensification of the imperialist war in Vietnam, and a number of other clandestine operations, including working on a psychological warfare campaign with Alan Dulles and Dick Bissell in 1949 that consisted in studying the use of Marshall funds in Europe in order to finance the anti-communist struggle by using and mobilizing intellectuals, union leaders, and political figures in this battle of ideas against communism. And so it's within this larger context that we have to see the global theory industry as part of the soft power that was used in the global war on communism and part of the larger kind of imperialist project. It's the cultural element of that imperialist project.
Bueno, debo añadir a las personas que nos están escuchando que el profesor Rockhill, lo que acaba de decir, pues es producto de varios años de investigación, sabe muy bien de lo que habla. El profesor Rockhill es autor de 9 libros. También es autor de numerosos artículos, tanto académicos como periodísticos, entre ellos uno titulado La CIA y el anticomunismo de la Escuela de Frankfurt, que publicamos recientemente en Canaria Semanal. Otro interesante es La CIA lee teoría francesa, sobre la tarea intelectual de desmantelar la cultura de la izquierda. Y en preparación tiene un libro cuyo título es muy sugerente y él lo acaba de mencionar en su intervención, que es La Guerra Mundial Intelectual, el fallido intento de la CIA de matar la idea del comunismo. Profesor Rockhill, actualmente usted ha hablado de la izquierda compatible. Actualmente asistimos, al menos en la órbita de las democracias liberales de Occidente, a un escenario parlamentario en el que la llamada izquierda no se diferencia en la práctica de la derecha en cuanto a política económica y exterior. Podemos decir que es una izquierda no anticapitalista, inclusive una izquierda antimarxista, que solo se diferencia de la derecha en aspectos culturales, como es, por ejemplo, la llamada política de las identidades, ese énfasis en las diferencias de sexo, género, raza, orientación sexual, todas menos la de clase. En el caso de Estados Unidos, pues hablaríamos del Partido Demócrata, en el Estado español del Partido Socialista Obrero Español y de Unidas Podemos, la nueva formación populista, y podríamos añadir ejemplos de otros países del entorno. Esto sugiere que la estrategia de control de las agencias de inteligencia y su objetivo de crear una izquierda compatible parece haber logrado pleno éxito. Pero hay otro aspecto que observamos con verdadero asombro y es cómo la derecha, la ultraderecha sobre todo, llama marxismo cultural a la política de las identidades y a la tendencia a lo políticamente correcto que promueve la izquierda institucional. ¿Hay algún gramo de verdad en esto o es completamente falsa esta asunción de marxismo cultural?
It's true that class struggles include fights over the very nature of the ideological battlefield. and that historically this has meant that the right wing and the reactionaries have a vested interest in moving the coordinates of the battlefield to the right. And we can see this, for instance, in attacks on Obama or Biden as being socialist or communist. And of course, from a certain vantage point, we could see this is absolutely laughable because they're not only capitalists, but they're rabid imperialists. But the purpose that this serves is to displace the entire debate to the right, meaning the very ideological ground is displaced, so that this at once confuses people, but it shores up the idea that the true battle is not between the capitalists and the anti-capitalists, but between two different versions of a pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist agenda. And so the term of cultural Marxism often indexes the work of the Frankfurt School and certain Marxian, as opposed to Marxist, modes of analysis, meaning that they draw on the Marxist tradition, but have parted in very serious ways with it. That what this does is create an image of the so-called Marxist left that is anti-communist and against actually existing socialism. So what we see here is a kind of foundational ideological struggle that is trying to shift everything to the right, and arguably in certain instances, at least within the professional managerial class, has been successful. I know myself in my studies, when I was exposed to Marxism, I was exposed to this form of Eurocentric, social chauvinistic, pro-imperialist form of Marxism that regularly and systematically claims that there is no alternative because the alternative is totalitarianism and much, much worse. And in that regard, I think that this orientation has had an enormous impact on the professional managerial class, at the very least, within the capitalist core. And of course, they play a fundamental role in trying to manage the minds of the masses, both within the global north, but then also within the global south through cultural imperialism and some of the things that we were just talking about. This is one of the reasons that I think we have to see the history of cultural Marxism as an attempt to redefine Marxism as a compatible Marxism, right, or as a compatible form of left, because that's a much better opponent than those forms of leftism that would actually go to the root of problems. And that we have to see that this cultural Marxism is also linked to the development of identity politics and some of the other things that you mentioned in your comments and questions, because identity politics is largely driven by a shift away from class analysis and in the favor of a representational and symbolic politics that have to do with isolated identities and the need purportedly to either represent them, listen to them, and things like this, without actually changing the material conditions that produce those marginalized identities in the first place. And what's interesting historically, of course, is that the cultural Marxism of the Frankfurt School was already doing much of this work. They were pivoting away from political economy, away from political analysis and class analysis in the favor of culturalist analysis, so that they were focusing on things like anti-Semitism, but outside of a class analysis and outside of an analysis of how those cultural elements are themselves driven by class factors in many ways, such as the attack on the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, or purportedly Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy, that was driven, of course, by capitalist interest. So we have to see this as a larger political project that's trying to redefine the horizons of our politics, or the very grammar of our politics, so that we get rid of class analysis and replace it by representational and symbolic orientations. And the last thing that I would say on that front is that this has also produced an incredibly false image of history that is absolutely essential to the political and ideological work of not only the right wing, but the kind of pro-capitalist camp. And that is depicting the Marxist tradition as somehow uninterested in or uninvested in questions of race, gender, and sexuality. And there is perhaps no larger straw person argument than the argument that consists in saying that the people who have dedicated their lives to overcoming imperialism, social chauvinism, racism, gender oppression, and sexual oppression are somehow just a bunch of white bros who haven't thought about anything like feminism or anti-racism or other such things. So we could talk more about this, but I think it's really important that people know their history and don't let their enemies tell them who their enemies are.
¿Le han dicho alguna vez que sus hipótesis son teoría de la conspiración? ¿Cómo respondería a esta crítica?
Well, conspiracy theory, as it's at least generally used in public discourse within the capitalist world regarding some of the issues that we've just talked about, is best understood as a weapon of class warfare, whose principal objective is to peremptorily exclude as beyond the pale certain forms of materialist analysis. Because by labeling them as conspiracy theories, the goal is to banish them as heretical without looking at any of the evidence. And this is extremely important because it is a way of preempting any sober scientific investigation in favor of an ideologically conditioned reflex that requires absolutely no knowledge, right? The guiding idea is that the person in question is making false assumptions that are quite simply irrational and shouldn't be listened to. Right? And one of the ways that conspiracy theories have been developed as a weapon of war against materialist analysis is by affiliating historical materialist analyses of actually existing conspiracies on the part of the capitalist ruling class, the political elite, and the intelligence industries that they use, with superstitious conspiracy theories that traffic in free association and magical thinking, right? So that you have things like a Jewish conspiracy or the Zionist occupation government or wacky presumptions about QAnon. And these are put under the same umbrella of conspiracy theories as actual materialist analyses of conspiracies that have often been proven to be true. And so I think it's important to recognize that there are ways in which what is rejected as conspiratorial thinking is in part, you know, I'm only talking about one half of these kind of what's under the umbrella of conspiracy theories, is the materialist investigation into the covert operations of the ruling class and their political elite to act in their self-interest and to lie about it to the general public in order to advance their agenda. This is dismissed as conspiratorial thinking, meaning that what is verboten, what is off the table, what is forbidden, is to suggest for a second that the capitalist ruling class might hire people who could execute orders in a covert fashion that would be in their own best interest. What we need to understand is that the capitalist ruling class instead is benevolent and operating in our best interest. And therefore, we should never pull the curtain back in order to look at the wizard behind the machine. We should simply believe the political theater that they have advanced. It's extremely important to highlight. You pointed out Operation Gladio in your opening comments, and I'm glad that you did, because it's a proven conspiracy of the most heinous sort in which the CIA collaborated with MI6 in order to commit acts of terrorism against an innocent civilian population and blame those acts of terrorism on communists and socialists in order to round them up, throw them in prison, and try to leverage public opinion in the direction of supporting right-wing authoritarian governments. This is a conspiracy that was proven in Italian courts, and there's a European Parliament resolution on Gladio calling for further investigation on the part of the states of Europe. But there are many other proven conspiracies. The 1934 business plot I've written about in a piece in Liberation School was a conspiracy on the part of the leading robber barons in the United States, the Morgan family, DuPont family, Rockefeller family, Pew and Mellon, to establish a fascist dictatorship within the United States. This was proven by the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, which was a House committee, and it is part of the public record that this conspiracy took place, even though none of the conspirators were prosecuted for their actions. The General Motors streetcar conspiracy is a proven conspiracy based on a court case that took place in 1949. Iran-Contra is a proven conspiracy. Many people don't know that Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination is a proven conspiracy, not according to me, but according to a court of law in 1999 that listened to the testimony of some 70 witnesses over weeks and found that Martin Luther King Jr. was not assassinated by a lone gunman, but was instead assassinated in a conspiracy involving, quote, U.S. intelligence services, right? So there are many proven conspiracies. Therefore, from a historical and materialist vantage point, what we have to do is recognize that there's actually a pattern to these conspiracies. And it's a pattern that involves the interests of the capitalist ruling class and their political hench people who work for them. This can be the political elite, but it can also be the intelligence services and other such things that are driving to advance their agenda while simultaneously trying to convince people that they don't have an agenda because they're acting in our own best self-interest. The last thing that I would say in this regard is that it's also important to know that the Central Intelligence Agency itself has been involved very directly in putting forth and promoting the use of the label of conspiracy theory in order to discredit and delegitimate materialist analyses of actually existing history. In particular, I would encourage your viewers and listeners to look at the CIA dispatch 1035-960. It is this dispatch that outlines what the CIA's plans were in the wake of the JFK assassination, John F. Kennedy's assassination, and questions being raised about the Warren Commission investigation, which should be raised because the Warren Commission was largely a hoax. And one of the things that the CIA decided to do instead of reopening investigations in the Kennedy assassination was to run a campaign to discredit anyone who raised questions about the Kennedy assassination as conspiratorial. And they explicitly point out in this dispatch that the Central Intelligence Agency should employ, this is a quote, employ propaganda assets to negate and refute the attacks of the critics. Our ploy should point out as applicable that the critics are wedded to theories adopted before the evidence was in, which is a conspiracy theory, that they're politically interested, financially interested, hasty and inaccurate in their research, infatuated with their own theories, end quote. So the weapon of conspiracy theory has actually been directly used by the Central Intelligence Agency in order to try to halt historical materialist analyses and affiliate them, moreover, with superstitious thinking, harebrained ideas, and other such things. What we need to do in response to that is to undertake sober scientific analysis and open up the spectrum of analysis to bring in all of the evidence and make informed claims over the nature of history.
Usted fundó y dirige el taller de teoría crítica, de Critical Theory Workshop, que tiene también su versión francesa. Explíquenos por qué se fundó, cuáles son sus actividades y quiénes pueden participar en él. Pero sobre todo por qué se fundó, conectando un poco con lo que acabamos de explicar.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that within the extant system of knowledge production that we've been talking about, the universities, think tanks, and research centers, they're largely controlled by those who own the means of intellectual production. And therefore, there are relatively strict limits to what is acceptable within that framework. And so my own work has led not only to personal, investigations and research, but also to the recognition that we need to work collectively to develop institutional power that allows us to have types of conversations and modes of investigation that are either marginalized or in certain cases just excluded from extant institutions. So I founded the Critical Theory Workshop in 2008. And it's been an ongoing process of elaboration, but it basically functions as an educational nonprofit that brings together scholars and researchers from around the world. Some of them are professional academics, some of them are journalists and activists and are, intellectuals in the broader and I think more correct sense of the term. And the goal is to foster collective research where the parameters that are set regarding the kind of left border of critique that I was mentioning earlier are suspended so that we can look at the evidence and have adult conversations about things that are sometimes very difficult to discuss within university settings, particularly within the global north, like actually existing socialism, like the situation in China, like what the situation is in Cuba or other such things. And so we offer a number of free classes, webinars, seminars, and things like this. We have a summer school that we've been running for years that takes place in Paris, but also online. We, as a kind of institutional nonprofit, we also try to do a little bit of fundraising because we don't have any resources that come from universities, from grants, from the capitalist ruling class. We have small and minor agreements with different organizations and individuals that allow us to cobble together the means by which we can do what it is that we're doing. But we are also eager to expand and collaborate with other people. And given that this conversation is taking place, at least in part, in Spanish, one of our longstanding plans is to develop a kind of institute or a kind of week-long study and research group in somewhere in Latin America. And so we've been exploring this possibility over the last 2 years, looking for collaborators and things like this, because the type of research that we're interested in is not only resolutely interdisciplinary and opening up the spectrum of analysis, but it's resolutely internationalist, so that we have people who are coming from around the world, speaking different languages, and can help all of us escape from the kind of parochialism and social chauvinism that often comes with being trapped within a certain region of the world, particularly those within the global north, because this comes with certain assumptions regarding the rest of the world and that are the result of the deep history of cultural imperialism that we were talking about earlier.
Estamos deseando que ese proyecto en América Latina salga adelante y también que se publique pronto el libro que tiene en preparación sobre la Guerra Mundial Intelectual, que estamos seguros que va a ser muy interesante. Y solamente me resta darle las gracias de nuevo por haber aceptado esta invitación. Y bueno, y esperar que en el futuro podamos seguir colaborando de alguna manera entre las dos orillas del Atlántico.
Sí, muchísimas gracias.
A usted, profesor.